Australia in 1943 was at war with Germany and Japan. American troops filled the streets of the eastern capital cities. The extraordinary and tense times had created an upsurge in crime and vice as inhibitions were discarded. Melbourne had been shocked by the serial murders of the singing strangler Eddie Leonsky only months before. On the evening of the 6th of February 1943, a Saturday, taxi driver Francis John Phelan left his home at 1018 Drummond Street, North Carlton. For 4 years he had leased a vehicle from Red Top Taxis, so was free to choose his own hours, having previously driven for another taxi company. With all the cashed-up Yanks looking for some fun to relieve the stress of military life, a Saturday night in summertime should be profitable. Phelan had remarked that he was able to touch the Americans for higher fares than he could convince locals to pay. He boasted that he could earn up to £15 per shift, although other drivers doubted this. Phelan, born in Kyabram, Victoria in 1911, was 31 years of age. He had had one brush with the law in 1935. In April of that year he was caught on a train at Townsville, Queensland, evading the fare. It was a minor crime, but he didn't have the £2 to pay off the fine, so was locked up for 14 days at the Home Hill Watch House. Due to overcrowding, short-term prisoners like Phelan were only locked in at night. Even though it was only 2 weeks, the 23-year-old wasn't going to hang about. On the 20th of April, he had his dinner at 6:40 p.m. and then slipped out. It wasn't until 9 p.m. that he was noticed missing from among the 20 prisoners held there at the time. Phelan's description was 5'9", 11 stone, with fair hair and blue eyes. He was recaptured on the 4th of May, 60 miles south, at Bowen. For the escape, the young man was sentenced to 6 months with hard labour at Stewart's Creek Jail. But that was all part of his wild youth and long ago by 1943. Phelan was married now, and he and Joyce, his wife of 7 years, had 4 children aged between 6 years and 18 months. He was regarded as quiet and jovial by his workmates, always with a smile on his face. He was fighting fit, capable of taking care of himself. His wife, though, added he had a quick temper and often had trouble with fares. He enjoyed playing billiards and was a fan of boxing, but other than that, providing for his family was his life. They had previously lived at Sandringham, where they had bought their own home as well as a block of land, before moving to Carlton. Phelan was seen 3 times between 8 and 8:30 p.m. driving his taxi. At 8:15 he was driving toward the city on St Kilda Road, with an American soldier in the front seat and civilians in the back, and was again seen with passengers in Swanston Street in Melbourne at 8:30. Around 9 p.m. that night, 2 men were seen standing beside a taxi in St Edmund Street, engaged in earnest conversation, while another man sat in the front passenger seat. The taxi was driven off towards Izzard Street. Also around 9 p.m, shots were heard by people in the Prahran and South Yarra area. It was later deduced that at this time Phelan was driving a lone passenger in his cab on St Edmund Street, near the intersection with Greville Street. The passenger was seated in the front alongside Phelan when he took out a heavy calibre pistol and fired a shot into the driver. As Phelan slumped over the wheel, he was shot twice more, hitting him in the shoulder and the back. The killer then drove a short way up Izzard Street, which continued over Greville Street, and there dumped the body out into the gutter before driving onto Commercial Road at another half a mile and abandoning the car by tram tracks at the corner of Punt Road. Keith Kenworthy had seen a man park the taxi, get out and walk casually away, south along Punt Road. Unfortunately, darkness had fallen around 8:30 p.m, and he could not tell in the gloom whether the man was dressed in civilian clothes or in uniform, although he was certain the man was not wearing a hat. The first passer-by to notice Phelan's body shortly after 9 p.m. presumed him to be a drunk. The body was laying on its back, feet pointed towards Commercial Road, with arms outstretched, on the western side of the road, about 75 yards from Commercial Road. A street lamp on the other side of the road, 30 feet away, illuminated the spot. The body was less than 5 feet from the bay window of a house, but the two houses closest to the spot were both unoccupied from 7 p.m. that night. The man, David Newnham, alerted police to his discovery. 2 constables went to attend to the drunk, but when they lifted the body, discovered the clothes saturated in blood. Phelan was still warm. When Phelan's body was examined, there were 3 entrance wounds and 2 exit wounds. 1 bullet had gone through his heart, the other through his shoulder and back. 1 bullet was removed from the body, 1 was found in the clothing, and the other was located in the taxi. It was observed that there was a name painted on a fence opposite where the body lay. When Francis Phelan was identified, the name drew a double take. In white paint was the name L. Phelan. Investigations soon discounted this, as the name had been there for months and had no connection to the taxi driver. An Allied soldier under the influence of drink was seen near the scene where the body was found about 10 p.m. that same night. About 10:15 he caught a taxi and departed. Whether this had anything to do with the case or another coincidence is not known. Meanwhile, Phelan's taxi with registration plate ED947 was noticed by another red-top driver who directed a police patrol to it. Police found spent shells in the taxi and a ricochet mark, proving the murder had occurred in the cab, but the weapon used had been retained by the murderer. The ammo used was found to be similar to that issued to the US military. A lack of blood suggested Phelan was pushed from the taxi soon after being shot. Also discovered in the cab was a clue, which no doubt convinced police an early resolution to the case was at hand. An American soldier's cap with 2 names on the sweatband was recovered from the back seat. Sergeant Robert Willard French said the cap was his. He had sold it to another Marine when in camp in South Carolina in 1941. Quartermaster Sergeant John Freeman Martin confirmed this when he said he bought the cap from French. He added the cap was stolen from the pocket of his greatcoat while on a transport ship to New Zealand in the winter of 1942. With the discovery that a US service pistol was the likely murder weapon, and a US soldier's cap left in the cab, the US Army Provost Corps, the military police, were brought in to liaise with the Melbourne detectives, being led by Detective Sergeant McGuffey. Detectives were now faced with the mystery of why Phelan had been shot. He had £11, 15 shillings and 5 in his pocket when the body was found, which ruled out robbery as the motive. In 2022, that would be the equivalent of over $800 Australian. Theories that someone with a grudge had targeted him, or that a violent argument had quickly flared up, were pursued. Phelan was hard of hearing, and it was even conjectured that maybe he had replied to something he had misheard in such a manner that the passenger reacted violently to it. Police also revealed that Phelan had a shady reputation, as far as they were concerned. Taxi drivers during the tumultuous war years were able to steer troops towards the delights of the Melbourne nightlife, which included the sly grog outlets, gambling games, and disorderly houses. It was said that Phelan would allow ladies of a certain calling to pursue such in the back seat with their eager customers. A fellow taxi driver said Phelan would carry women in his cab specifically to entice American soldiers to jump in. As these occupations often involved the underworld, police tried hard to find if Phelan had run afoul of someone in that milieu. Despite hoping something would be found, there was nothing to connect him intimately to any nefarious activities or their sponsors. Ultimately, there was no motive that could be proven. The reason for the murder would have to wait to be explained until the killer was apprehended. On the 8th of February at Trades Hall, at a meeting of taxi drivers, 2 minutes' silence was observed for their murdered mate, and a collection taken up for his widow and children. Phelan was buried on the 9th of February in the Roman Catholic section of Fawkner Cemetery. With the investigation going nowhere, an inquest was held on the 9th of March. A verdict of murder by a person unknown was delivered. A break in the case was promised by a letter writer in May 1943. The writer claimed to be a woman living in Prahran who had information to give, but sought assurances of protection and secrecy. Although police failed to do so, the letter writer never got back in touch. The case hit the headlines again in May 1944, when a recently discharged soldier, 23-year-old Melbourne wharf labourer John Francis Downey, was charged with wounding with intent to kill 5 people. He had confessed to these crimes, as well as the murder of Phelan, due to torture applied by detectives, which included the use of a baton on his neck and soap in his eyes, he claimed in court. Nevertheless, he was convicted of bludgeoning 16-year-old Betsy Ann Adamson and 21-year-old Margaret Mann with an axe in their bedroom at Albert Park on the 16th of July 1943, and fracturing the skull of Lily McCartney in her bedroom at Middle Park on the 7th of December 1943. 2 other charges of assaulting Mary Taylor and Ian Rifle as they sat on the grass at Albert Park on the 16th of December were not proceeded with. For the 3 attacks he was convicted of, Downey was sentenced to death. On the 19th of June 1944, this was commuted to life imprisonment. Downey was released from prison by about 1950 and died aged 60 at St Kilda in 1982, leaving a widow and 8 children. The spate of bedroom invasions and attacks ceased with the arrest of Downey, so he probably was the culprit, but these crimes were totally dissimilar to the shooting of Phelan. The murder of Francis Phelan went cold and remains unsolved. The weapon used suggests a US soldier may have been the killer. It was not out of the question. Private John C. Leatherbury was hanged at the age of 21 in Somerset, England, on the 16th of March 1944, for strangling and battering to death taxi driver Henry Hailstone on the 8th of December 1943. His accomplice, Private George Fowler, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Then again, maybe not. US weapons were purchased and stolen during the war years, being especially desired by criminals. Maybe the solution to the taxi mystery was in the Melbourne underworld, where loose lips were rare. Possibly Phelan's alleged use of prostitutes rankled someone in the same line of business. The 2 Marines dragged into the case by the stolen cap both survived the war. Sergeant Martin went on to fight in the Korean War and died aged 74 in 1985. Sergeant French retired as a rural postman in 1979 and passed away in Florida, aged 86, in 2004. It is thought Phelan's widow may have remarried in the late 1940s.